In the half-century or more since his first exhibition, the work of Henry Moore has been seen in almost every country in the world. He's made a staggering total of something like 900 sculptures, many of them immense, as well as thousands of drawings and nearly 1,000 graphics. In one year, when he was in his 80s, he had more than 40 exhibitions. In the later part of his life, the demand for his work never stopped. He received almost every award and honour that one can possibly imagine. I believe that Henry Moore is one of the greatest sculptors since the Renaissance. He's been to the art of sculpture what Picasso was to painting. Picasso opened up so many new ways of painting. He was a revolutionary in the sense of breaking down all the old ways and suggesting new ways. Moore differed from Picasso in this respect. Moore, as modern as he may have seen at the beginning, never really lost his contact with tradition. He took the whole idea of 19th century sculpture, threw it away, but went back to what he called the world tradition of sculpture. And by that he meant looking at every culture in the world, going back as far as 40,000 years to the very sources of sculptural expression. But however modern, revolutionary, or surreal his sculpture may have seemed, his fundamental beliefs lay entirely within a humanistic tradition.
All our judgments of architecture, of form and everything else are based on the fact that we're human beings of the shape we are, and that we have a height of average between 5'6" and 6 feet, that we walk on 2 legs, that we have bones inside us, and that we can move in certain ways and not in other ways, that we understand from ourselves and from our mothers to begin with softness and hardness, all this. And if you don't, well, learn from your own body, you'll learn from nothing. And that's, for me, that the human body is the basis of all sense of form that all of us have. We learn how far a thing is away from us as a child by trying to touch the toy in the pram. We learn what is upright and so on because we ourselves. If we were like horses and could go to sleep on all fours, all our architecture, all our art would be different. Of course it would.
Of course it would. Well, Henry Moore had that way of making very unusual and provocative ideas sound as though they were common sense and very down to earth. I must have known him as a child, but I don't have any memories of that. The first place I really remember meeting him was here, in fact, in this very room. Not a room so much as a studio. It was, in fact, Henry Moore's first studio when he moved out of London into the country. And because the film I made about him in 1950 was the first film I had ever made, it was also my first film studio. It was, in fact, a village shop once, and up the back there was what was the butcher's shop. And Moore, I remember, was delighted when they were digging around there to find the ground was full of huge shin bones and shoulder blades. And I think a lot of these probably gave him some inspiration for some of his sculpture. He certainly liked wearing a butcher's apron when he was working. I made 6 films about him over, I think, about 28 years, the last one for his 80th birthday. By then, I was beginning to feel as though I was a member of his staff.
John, if you can put that, come in between, if you can put that just somewhere on the side. Yeah, that's it, like that. No, it's about that and that. No, the other, turn it right round the other side. It's got a better, no, right round. No. Look, no. All right, turn it over again. There. Right. Now bring it over here. Now bring it in for that. Sit there. Look, that will be better, much better when you're out of the way. Look, you're standing in the light. There you are. Now,
when I went to see him, as his 80th birthday approached, I found him as eager to talk about his beliefs as ever. He is, amongst other things, a meticulous photographer of his own work, and attends to every detail with almost boyish enthusiasm.
Yeah, no, I don't want that white edge at the back. That's it. There. That doesn't matter about having a sharp edge. There we are. Now, see, that'll make it much better. There.
Moore's expert knowledge of photography was a great help to me when I made my first film there in 1950.
With the strange and impressive shapes that fill his studio, he picks up and carries on a tradition that has been extinct in England for 400 years, a tradition of expressiveness and truth to material. The studio is a workshop in which he turns his ideas into tangible forms. At first sight, this world is unfamiliar and puzzling to us. But the quality and quantity of Moore's work has a unity that could only come from great originality and strength. Sculpture of this kind is a challenge to our accepted ideas, and we must understand the sculptor's approach to his work before we can appreciate the work itself. The sculptor is distinguished from other artists by his materials and by the way he uses them. Here are Henry Moore's hands and his tools.
I learned from Moore a great deal about how to place and light sculpture for the camera, how to photograph it from many angles, how to move the camera right inside, as though entering a tunnel and walking through it. I also learned a great deal about art. I think I picked up from him really the basic sort of signposts in my own artistic belief. It was impossible to work so closely with Moore without really absorbing his ideas.
Henry Moore was born at Castleford in Yorkshire. It's a typical 19th century mining town. D.H. Lawrence was born in a very similar place in Nottinghamshire. There must be 100 others like it all over the country. Moore has been given the freedom of Castleford. They're as proud of him there as they would be if he'd played cricket for Yorkshire. He was born in 1898 in an ordinary terrace brick house. His father was a miner and a friend of Herbert Smith, who helped to found the Yorkshire Miners' Union. When times were bad, his mother went out to work. There were 8 children in the family altogether. 2 died, 3 became teachers, 1 was lost to sight in Canada. Henry, who went to the local school, was the one who was good at art. They still keep there a caricature of his headmaster, with his own name, much bigger, alongside. He carved it on the back of the school Roll of Honour, which he designed in 1916. He also wrote plays, acted in them, and designed the program covers. He was good at pottery, and in all these activities owed a great deal to the encouragement of his art teacher.
As a boy at school, I liked the art lessons. I liked drawing. I used to get my elder brother to draw horses for me and so on from as early as I can remember. But the little incident that clinches the thing in my mind was our parents used to send me and my younger sister to Sunday school on Sunday afternoons to get rid of us, I think mainly. And the Sunday school we went to was a congregational chapel, although we were Church of England. And the superintendent every Sunday used to give a talk about some little moral, would always have a point to the talk. And one Sunday he told us about Michelangelo carving the head of an old faun in the streets of, in his studio in the streets of Florence. And that a passerby stood to watch Michelangelo carving this head of an old faun, and after watching 2 or 3 minutes said to Michelangelo, but an old faun wouldn't have all its teeth in. Michelangelo immediately, said the superintendent, took his chisel, knocked out 2 of the teeth, and there he said was a great man listening to the advice of other people even though he didn't know them. Now this story didn't stick in my mind for its moral, but merely that there was someone, Michelangelo, a great sculptor, and from then onwards, instead of saying, like most boys might, that one wanted to be an engine driver and so on, this just pinpointed something in my mind, and I knew from then onwards.
In the early 1950s, Henry Moore could just walk out of the house and into this shed, and that was all there was to it. And this was the only studio. There was a small space outside, a kind of patio, which faced the garage door. All the work was done within that small area, right up till the time when he became a really famous and international figure. But of course, as his fame increased, his income increased, and with it, the size of his sculpture and the extent of the whole operation. It became quite extraordinary, the way Perry Green became almost a little country of its own, as Henry Moore occupied one building after another. It spread out over the fields, into the sheds and barns, and it became a kind of sculpture park.
By 1958, his studio had expanded greatly. Now that he was earning more, he could do more. His old studio was used more and more for small pieces, for polishing and finishing off castings, and for maquettes, and for the sort of jobs that assistants could do for him. The garden around the house had grown very considerably, and sculptures were placed in it to the best advantage. Beyond the garden, Moore had taken over 2 large fields and a small wood. In the first field, he'd built a new studio well away from the house, where he could work both night and day. It was built to his own design, with doors and roof high enough for his largest works, and a terrace onto which he could move his sculptures. This was important because he felt very strongly that sculpture meant to be looked at out of doors cannot be made entirely indoors.
Running a sculpture workshop on the scale that Henry Moore did made him something like the managing director of quite a large enterprise. All the same, he had a very strict routine to deal with all this. One wondered sometimes where and when he managed to do his actual creative work. But he'd have breakfast at 8, he would have a meeting with his staff at 9 o'clock to brief them for the day's jobs. He would read the Times perhaps for half an hour, and then he would sit down with his secretary and go through the mail, things like this, before going down to the studios to see what was happening. All this took place in a very simple, straightforward domestic routine, really very homely. And if you came down to see him, you would have lunch. Lunch would be cold lamb, baked potato, or something like that. Everybody had a bottle of Guinness, each separate bottle of Guinness by each plate, each one with its own little opener. I always remember that. You do sort of get sidelights on people. I remember having a dinner with the abstract sculptor Norm Gabbo, and he chose chicken, spring chicken, and watching him trying to carve that spring chicken, it was a total disaster. Within 2 minutes there was just wreckage on the plate. Now to see Moore carving into a sirloin of beef was one of the small joys of life. And in no time at all there was the most beautiful 2-piece reclining figure there. Of course, things could go wrong. There was a great occasion once, I think, when the sculpture fell off the back of a lorry on the motorway. It puzzled the police somewhat. We were lucky once, in fact, if lucky is the word, because we had cameras there when something quite serious went wrong.
The sculpture was tied by nylon straps to the jib of a massive crane. The hangar roof, only inches above, created problems. A false move, a faulty calculation, and the sculpture could slip, the crane overturn, the hangar be demolished. Noack drew the lines along which he would cut. He hoped to take out a whole half section in a single piece.
Whatever you do this Whitson, you must take your friends to Speedway Stock Car Racing.
As Noack cut the last few inches, the weight of the sculpture was transferred from its base to the straps. Anything could happen now.
All the places for Speedway Stock Car Racing, this Whitson.
Ja, und drüben brauchst du nicht ziehen. Nur so in der Waage halten. Das kann ruhig ein bisschen hier rauswandern.
Moore went to lunch. Things began to go wrong. The upper section had dropped, and its edge fouled the piece below. Ugly cracks appeared. The crane had no room to maneuver and was very nearly off balance. The section had to be cut free. Then it happened. The top section had cracked at its narrowest part. The plaster was torn, the armature had snapped. The falling piece swung into the other half of the sculpture and made an ugly dent. By the time they'd got the first piece out, Moore came back from lunch. Surprisingly, he was calm, philosophical, and above all, practical.
It can be mended. I mean, this is what life is. Sometimes you'll purposely destroy a thing to make something else out of it. Art is not a process of just gradual perfection. You have accidents, you have troubles, you have difficulties, you destroy things, you discard something, you make a new thing, and all this is the way you live. So you take the rough with the smooth.
I don't think it's very surprising that working with Henry Moore on doing films was an education in itself. Education, I think, was very close to his heart. Not only had he benefited so much from hard work and education himself, scholarship boy and so on, he had the greatest respect for his teachers, or some of them at least, a great respect for what he got out of museums, a great respect, I think, for teaching himself as a duty. He liked taking people round, he liked making films, he liked explaining, and he was jolly good at it. He knew exactly how to use the television and film medium.
Primitive art makes a straightforward statement. Its primary concern is with the elemental, and its simplicity comes from a direct and strong feeling, which is very different from being simple for the sake of being simple, which only leads to emptiness. I think you'll see what I mean if you look at this Mexican pottery figure. It was made by someone with a direct and immediate response to life, to whom art was a channel for expressing strong hopes, beliefs, and fears.
Well, this was, for me, an important stage of my development as a sculptor, because although I was still mainly a stone sculptor, in fact, completely absorbed in stone carving, I was dissatisfied with the usual idea of direct carving, in which the forms are all so embedded in each other that they don't have a free, independent existence. And here I was trying to make so that, say, this form, which is like the shape of an egg, which is the body, is completely, almost completely realized, though not separated from the rest. That is, that I was making the forms realized enough and yet compact enough. It was a very important stage in my development as a sculptor. Also, I was in this getting the freedom to mix forms, the forms of one thing with the forms of another, and yet perhaps making a unit, kind of organic unit, out of the whole. And this I've done at later times. I mean, here is the back view of a figure. This is a kind of egg. This is the sort of head. And it has, the whole has some sort of sense of a jug. But it is an organic form. And I remember a little child, my niece, I think, who was very young, when she first saw this, she said, "Oh, an elephant in an armchair," which was I was very pleased that she had felt some real object, some real person.
Sometimes Henry Moore's simple common sense explanations seemed a bit too simple when one thought about the works that he made. He was always ready to explain the sturdy dimensions of his female figures by telling that old story of his about how he used to rub his mother's back as a child to help her with her rheumatism. It's certainly true that his chief muse was an Earth Mother, but I wonder sometimes if there wasn't also a Venus or an Aphrodite in the background. Some of his work seems to me to be sensual and tender, extremely beautiful and sexually overt. But the erotic content, if that's what we should call it, was something he wasn't at all anxious to talk about.
The whole of life is made up of the, I mean, if you want to look, if you want to interpret form from this point of view, then everything is sex. And the appreciation, everybody's appreciation of form is built on this appreciation of sex. I think that part of my early training as a young sculptor comes from going to a mixed secondary school, where I could look at all the girls' legs, all from the age of 12 or 13, and I could tell you in the school, which girl was which, if you'd only shown me her figure from the knee downwards. This was, so this, I mean, this is but it isn't that thing that you mean. I mean, the fullness of form, the tautness of form, all these things are connected with life, and life is sex and so on. So it's not a conscious thing that you use your brain over.
I suppose to many people, especially in the 40s and 50s, Henry Moore was best known as the man who made sculptures with a hole in. In fact, of course, the thing he was best known for was the reclining figure. But these reclining figures, many of which he did just before the war, beautiful though they were only really admired and known about by a few people. The work that made him famous in the popular mind were his drawings, not his sculptures. And these drawings came about when the war started, and his friend Kenneth Clark, who was then director of the National Gallery, appointed him as a war artist.
I used to go into London 2 or 3 days a week to do my shelter drawings. It's curious how they all started. To begin with, I hadn't wanted to be a war artist, although I had been asked to be, because to me there seemed nothing unusual and nothing different in that early period of so-called phony war that made any new experience or gave me any new experiences. But this particular night, for some reason or other, we came back by tube. And it was then that I first saw the shelterers down the tube. I began to be fascinated by all the people, the kind of family life that they were leading, and these children still fast asleep, although the trains were rattling by and making terrific din. And there, stretched out in front of me, were rows and rows of reclining figures, Henry Moore reclining figures. One imagined that perhaps there'd never been scenes like that, so general, except perhaps when the slaves were all being exported from Africa to America in the holds of slave ships. People would be all crowded together like that, probably. Sometimes, like in this, I was trying to make two people there seem as though they were sculpture or in a tomb, because down below it did feel sometimes like a tomb. So occasionally my sculptural interests come into it, and I may distort figures or change them for sculpture purposes. But ordinarily it was me trying to record the experiences that one had, because it was intensely human. There was even humor and so on occasionally. It was a very... here there are distortions in a way, like the thinness of the legs and the pointedness that they are, to give, well, or something, not consciously, but sometimes pointed forms, give a kind of sense of fear, which other forms don't.
It was something of a paradox, wasn't it, that what Henry Moore became famous for was not the open air and the human figure in the landscape, is what he believed in, but for these figures trapped and enclosed underground in the dark. But of course, his greatest single contribution, I think, to the art of sculpture was this idea of being able to combine one's feeling about the landscape and one's feeling about the human figure, not as two separate things, but as one single image. He saw the figure as a landscape, he saw the landscape as a figure. A romantic idea, a romantic tradition in English literature and in English painting, combined now in one single body of work.
One of the most characteristic qualities of Moore's work is the way in which the contours and shapes of the human figure are used to echo certain qualities of landscape. For the first time in the whole history of art, a sculptor has successfully extended his subject to incorporate landscape which hitherto had remained the painter's domain. The flow of a skyline, the slope of a hill, the qualities of light and shade and of space out in the open can affect a sculptor as much as a painter. Poets, painters, writers, and particularly English artists have a long tradition of romantic absorption in the emotional relationships between man and the natural world in which he lives. This very special sculptural quality of landscape, rather strange and wild, immensely powerful and monumental, was certainly something Moore knew all about from his childhood excursions on the Yorkshire moors. In the quiet, civilized fields of Hertfordshire, his sculptures generated this same power. A leg is clothed in a massive cliff face of drapery, which flows over a body whose trunk is as strong as the trunk of a tree. The shoulder supported on the arm is a hill, and the head almost a monument or a lookout post on a summit. An enclosed field with summer trees and hedges becomes a place of mystery. Figures half in sun, half in shade, seem to exercise an ancient and uncanny spell. Their bony fossil-like forms are smooth, immensely strong, and seem as old as life itself. There is a remote glen in Scotland which has become a kind of sculpture valley. By a deserted track, a solitary figure stands like a sentinel, and the winds blow between its slender limbs. Nearby, on rising ground, another group sits in a position of command. They embody the idea of royalty. The heads of this king and queen are abstracted into shapes which combine ancient symbols of majesty: the bird head, the beak, the beard, the crown. They have about them a fierceness, too, appropriate to the authority of tribal rulers. Yet in details, the sculptor's vision is intensely realistic, suggesting the ordinary humanity behind the symbols of regal power. The bodies are smoothed and rounded as though molded and weathered by the elements into forms of sinuous strength. The king and queen are guardians and rulers of the kingdom that stretches beneath their gaze to the distant border. Behind, an immense monument in bronze, a ton in weight, rests on the hilltop. It can be seen like a beacon for miles away. It stands exposed like a massive boulder, left there by a glacier thousands of years ago. Moore calls this a crucifixion form, combining in it suggestions of a cross, a severed torso, and human suffering.
In 1963, then 65 years old, Henry Moore received the highest award that a civilian can receive in Britain. He was given the Order of Merit. Now that might have been a point, you would think, for him to put his feet up and to retire. But in fact, he was at his creative peak, and artists indeed don't retire. He had already started dividing up the reclining figure into 2 pieces, 3 pieces, 4 pieces. There were entirely new ideas and themes emerging. One of the best sculptures of that time, I think, was his atom piece, which dealt with the whole business of atomic power and atomic energy within one symbol that he invented. He also was able to really do anything he wanted in terms of size and scale. There were no technical limits any longer to what he could do. There were no financial limits. He also began to go to Italy, and there he bought a small 2-bedroom villa, a very modest place, in a little seaside town that was called Forte dei Marmi. Now, Moore was not really the man for family holidays. There was always a reason behind these trips abroad. And Forte dei Marmi was very near the marble quarries, the very famous Carrara marble quarries where Michelangelo had worked.
To the chemist, marble is just calcium carbonate. To the workers in the mountain villages, it's a job. To the directors of the Enro quarries, where Michelangelo got his stone, it's almost a religion, a mystique. Moore, of course, doesn't work up in the mountains, but he never fails to get there every year to Altissimo, the highest peak, and to talk to people who go with him about Michelangelo.
Perhaps I've got a tremendous admiration and obsession almost with Michelangelo. And to be up in the very same mountain and to have pointed out to me the cave where Michelangelo quarried some of the stone, and to realize what difficulties he must have had, what superhuman problems he had to cope with. That, plus the unbelievable romantic impression, the spectacular scenery. He's rather like a runner who could run a 4-minute mile, but Michelangelo could run a 3-minute mile. This sort of admiration that one has, as I look at the Altissimo, all this comes back. And so it's all mixed up with one's feeling for Michelangelo. He'd have a stronger feeling about the marble than we have because he had to quarry it himself. I have the advantage, as we all have now, of choosing the stone after it's been quarried for us. We don't have to do all that terrific work. I mean, some of us may grumble, some of us may think that we have difficult problems, but our problems are nothing compared with what a person like Michelangelo, the problems he had.
I think somehow in Italy, Moore found that the association with Carrara was in some way fulfilling his destiny. This feeling that he had for Michelangelo was really quite deep and profound within him. And of course, it was quite widely shared there in Italy. He used to go to a little beach hut. He didn't go to any of the grand hotels or to the beach clubs or the fashionable places, but each year to exactly the same place, a little row of huts. And the old lady who's in charge of these huts got to know him very well. I borrowed his hut for a day on the beach, and when we went down and introduced myself, she said, "Ah, Henry Moore," she said, and then with the most eloquent gesture, she pressed her knuckles onto her forehead. "Henry Moore, Michelangelo." He was very fond of games, and he had a great sense of fun. Sometimes this came out in things they did while you were talking quite seriously. In fact, Henry Moore never switched off the sculptural part of his mind. As you were sitting there with him, he was quite literally sizing you up, weighing you up. I can think of several instances of this sort of instinct that was always there. Talking with him about sculpture and his interlocking pieces, he simply illustrated the idea by taking some potato crisps out of the basin on the bar and fixing them together in different ways to make his point. Another time, after we'd been filming, we were sitting having dinner on the hotel, and enjoying the meal and enjoying the Chianti. And he suddenly looked at me and said, I bet I can tell you the circumference of your head. Well, I haven't the foggiest idea. But he guessed, and he measured it with a tape measure, because he always carried a tape measure in his pocket. You would never find Henry Moore anywhere in the world without this little tape measure. And he measured my head, and he got it right within a quarter of an inch. He then went round everybody else in the film unit, the production assistant, the cameraman, the camera assistant, the sound recorders, measured all their heads, got every one of them absolutely dead right. Well, we were very impressed with this, so we went into the hotel lounge for coffee. It was a very respectable hotel. And we sat down on the chintz sofa and we said, well, come on, Henry, how high is the coffee table? Took out his tape measure, 23 inches. It was. He'd won again. How high is the lamp standard? What about the sideboard? And here was this amazing scene of England's greatest sculptor on his hands and knees with the tape measure, measuring up all the furniture to the rather tipsy applause of the film crew. In 1972, now in his 74th year, the Mayor of Florence invited Moore to arrange an exhibition in the grounds of the Belvedere Fortress that overlooked the city. It was to be the most spectacular and comprehensive exhibition of his lifetime. It was in a wonderful open-air setting, in the brilliant Italian sunshine, and surrounded by some of the greatest art of the Renaissance. At the time, Moore saw the opportunity as a challenge to show that his own work could stand comparison with the best of the Renaissance, with Masaccio and Michelangelo. He had, after all, been to Florence as a student many, many years before to study just those very works. Looking back on that exhibition now, it seems to me that it was a triumphant vindication, not only of the authority of Henry Moore's work, but also of the whole modern movement.
In 4 months, nearly 400,000 people came from all over the world to see the exhibition. Nothing could have been less like the inhibiting atmosphere of a museum or gallery. The placing of modern sculpture in a setting of Renaissance beauty was a provocative act of faith. The mood of the visitors was easy and relaxed, for in Florence, art is taken for granted as a natural part of life. The citizens of Florence took the exhibition to their hearts and proudly put its exhibits to uses the artist had not foreseen. Sculptures were photographed as if they were film stars, religious relics or fashion models. At times, the terraces of the Belvedere had the atmosphere of a fairground or festival. It was a public pleasure ground, filled with movement and people and prospects of sculpture that continually changed with the time of day or the vagaries of the weather. In the Renaissance, Michelangelo had nothing worse to face than the patient and deferential Vasari, the first biographer of the great artists of his time. Moore turned out in the rain to face television cameras and journalists with deadlines to meet and planes to catch. The great cathedral dome by Brunelleschi, the famous tower designed by Giotto, the museums and churches filled with works by Fra Angelico, Botticelli, Masaccio and Michelangelo all slipped by, an out-of-focus backdrop to a modern artist in the news. The big sculptures in the open air, each one cited by Moore himself, were what made this exhibition unique. One would have had to travel the world to see so much at any other time. This two-piece reclining figure is Moore's half-scale model for a work which stands in the Lincoln Center, New York. Oval with Points is one of his latest pieces. One edition of this is at Princeton University, America. This reclining figure, made in the 1950s, is the model for the much larger UNESCO figure which stands in Paris, carved from Roman travertine marble. Crucifixion form, bronze, 1955. The best-known version of this stands on the top of a mountain in Scotland. reclining figure Arch Leg, one copy in California, another in Jerusalem. Torso, 1967. There are 9 castings of this. There is such a demand for Moore's work that editions of 6 or 7 are quite usual. King and Queen, 1952. There are editions of this in Scotland, London, Germany and New York. Square form with cut, 1970. Solid marble from Carrara.
Of course, at the time, nobody believed for a minute that that retrospective exhibition in Florence was going to be the last Henry Moore retrospective. In fact, his exhibitions continued year after year in almost every country in the world. But sculpture is a tough, hard trade. And gradually, as he got older, Moore turned more and more to drawing. Now, drawing he used to do simply to find out what he wanted to do in sculpture. It was a means to an end or a way of training his eye. But now he was doing drawing for its own sake.
I've always been fascinated by sheep. I think there's something about sheep which no other animal, for me, has quite that ancient biblical quality. And I began drawing the sheep, just merely because I couldn't do my sculpture. Not because I intend doing a sculpture of sheep, but merely because I enjoy drawing. And I enjoy sheep. So that for 2 or 3 weeks, while the packing was going on, I came down here each day and drew the sheep. And one of the things, as I found one could do, that if they came near the window, by tapping on the window, the sheep couldn't see inside because it's darker in here than it is in the field, but they were curious, they could hear, and they'd stand even for 5 minutes, just looking in this way, just looking through, trying to find out where the noise came from, and they'd stay like that for nearly 5 minutes, giving me the chance to draw them. But gradually I got to understand the shape of the sheep better through drawing them. To begin with, they were just round, fluffy lumps, balls of wool, it seemed. But underneath that, one discovered that, of course, there is the skeleton and the form of the sheep. And gradually I went on drawing them. I understood the shape of the sheep. Now I find that I can draw for its own sake, and not as I used to, with an ultimate motive in the drawing of using it for sculpture. Now I can draw and just enjoy the drawing, just enjoy drawing from life, drawing from nature. But I shall finish this probably as a kind of life cycle of sheep, because after this period, which I miss by being in Italy, there's a period when the sheep are shorn, and then they become entirely different creatures. I saw it happen, but I wasn't able to spend the time drawing. You must be able to guess the right proportions, otherwise you won't. I mean, your eye has to be a correct eye. You must know whether a thing is too black or too light, but it isn't the black and the lightness. And it isn't you've got to think of it as form. You've got to use perspective, which a thing that comes nearer to you is bigger than a thing that's further away. And often with students drawing a figure like me drawing you, they'll make, instead of making your foot and knee a bigger in proportion, it will be the same kind of length to it that it would be if you were standing up and all in the same plane. All those kind of things are things that one learns only by a lot of thinking. I mean, again, people think that artists are people that work for pleasure, by instinct, and without ever using their minds. There's a big and intellectual effort in learning to draw properly, which Leonardo showed it and Michelangelo showed it. Those had great intellects. It isn't a God-given gift to everybody that they can just draw. lately I've been drawing trees because the trunks of trees are remarkably like human figures. I do a close-up. This to me is like a knuckle or a knee or a breast, but there is the solidity and the body, the meat in it. And here we're just drawing the trunk and the kind of mother and child, or the big and the small, the big trunk and then the ivy growing up it. I think if I were an educationalist, I'd suggest that drawing should be made much more necessary or regular in schools, not because you're trying to make a nation of painters or sculptors or artists, but only because you teach grammar and literature, not because you're trying to make another lot of Shakespeare's, but to make them understand and use language. Well, in the same way, I think drawing is a tremendous eye-opener to people, and it would make their lives much richer.
Moore, I think, somewhere talked about art as being a stimulation to greater effort in living. Effort rather than enjoyment. But then for him, you see, work was enjoyment. I once asked him what he felt about the general attitude to culture in a modern age. Because there are times, in fact, when one wonders, really, whether there are not more important things than the arts. And he admitted with me that, in fact, for many people, the arts are not the most important thing in life, not certainly important to them as they would be to him, to a practicing artist. But, he said, can you name a single civilization in the past which we don't know about through its arts and its crafts, rather than its laws or any other aspect, its politics? It's the arts and the crafts by which we judge them. And he said every time in history when a civilization goes down, the arts decay first. Art, he said, is really like in a chemical formula, the thing that they call a catalytic agent. It's a tiny, tiny, small element within the whole, and yet without it, nothing happens. Art to him is the catalyst of society and of civilization. When he could work no more with the solid forms of sculpture, his mind turned to imaginary visions, mysterious images where forms emerged from darkness. In fluid and airy drawings, there were vague suggestions of shapes and hills, spires, and one felt that the mists might clear and a new world of form might be revealed. Now, around the fields and woods of the countryside, where he's worked for so many years, his sculptures give me a tremendous physical feeling of reassurance and of well-being. It not only comes from the protective maternal forms that he's exploited all his life, one might expect that, but also from works which give off immense energies and powers. They are symbols of endurance and tenacity. In the fields around his home, he has placed images as monumental as Stonehenge and infinitely more humane.